Well, howdy, folks. Welcome to Working Musicians. I'm your host, Dris Organica. Today's episode is going to be about choosing a mix engineer. I guess I'm obligated to say thanks to Bud Light for helping encourage this episode. Yes, Bud Light. Lighten your taste buds. Who am I kidding? I like this stuff. All right, so choosing a mix engineer. This is something that I've been thinking about here recently because this year I've worked on a couple of projects where they were actually mastering jobs, so to speak, and I got the mixes from the people because they were saying, "Oh yeah, they're not bad. It's just there's a few things I wish could be brought out a little bit more." And, I said, well, hey, let me see what you got. And, kind of take a stab at it. And I'll get these mixes back. And it's just like, man, I sure hope you didn't pay too much for this. Cause this is, they're just amateur. They're just amateur mixes. Not to say they sound bad, but they're nowhere near good or great mixes, regardless of, what the mix engineer had to work with. The bottom line is they're clearly, even if they were not the best recorded and performed tracks, they clearly were not mixed well or mixed by someone who really knows what they're doing to any level of being able to call themselves a mixing engineer. So I thought to myself, I'll go ahead and master this, and I'll be able to do a lot to help make it better. And it's funny because I don't really claim to be much of a mastering engineer. Yes, I can do it. There are definitely people who are more suited for the job. But it seems like I'm getting most of my mixing work because I previously mastered something that somebody else had mixed for them and done poorly. So after they hear what I can do with it, just, mixing a stereo file and calling it, or mastering a stereo file, they're then interested in working with me for recording and or mixing their next albums or musical releases. And so it's just something that's been on my mind here recently. There's just some things I notice that people don't really think about when they choose a mix engineer. And so I'm hoping that, maybe somebody listening can kind of take what I'm saying and really put it to use if they're considering having an album mixed by someone else. Okay, so choosing someone to mix your album. It seems like people really don't have a lot of choices in their mind. Nobody likes to pick up the phone and cold call, studios and all that kind of thing. I mean, clearly people do. Otherwise, all studios would be out of business. But let's face it, there's a reason why it's hard to make money as a studio because a lot of the stuff people feel they can do themselves, or there's other people like me who don't have professional studios with commercial locations who can actually put out pretty decent products and do good sound work. And then there are a lot of people who, quote unquote, have studios, whether they be professional or non, and they don't do very good work. And so I've noticed that people tend to stick to picking mix engineers based on this. They know the person or acquainted with them or know a guy who knows a guy, and they're willing to work with the whatever budget the artist has. And so I would say one of the big things to look out for is if you don't know anybody who's good at mixing, don't just settle on, well, I know this guy, he went to audio school, he just graduated, I guess I'll have him mix my album. Because there's a good chance they don't really know what they're doing yet. Going to school is great. Don't get me wrong. It definitely is better than not, but there's no substitution for experience, and there's no replacing talent, but talent is raw and has to be refined. And so I don't care how good of a set of chops somebody is when they first start out, they are going to be nowhere near the level of somebody who's put in the effort. Maybe if they're not naturally as talented at hearing something and picking a direction for it, but they've been doing it for 10 years. Even if they're not quite as naturally good with, don't have quite those golden ears, so to speak, the bottom line is if they haven't been doing it very long, you do not want them mixing your album because they're basically going to cut their teeth by making mistakes on your work. And if it's something that you ever intend to charge money for or actually try to release and do something with, you do not want an amateur basically practicing on your mix because then it just ends up sounding bad. And I've noticed a lot of people, they get these subpar mixes, and then, even better, the same person who doesn't even know how to mix, doesn't really understand EQ or compression, then masters it, and next thing you know, they're printing albums, trying to sell them and all that, and at the same time, the artist realizes that it's not that good sounding. Even if the songs are good, the album is just it's okay, but it sounds amateur. And at the end of the day, I think the fans deserve better. If you want people to buy your music and appreciate it, you need to do everything you can do to make it sound as good as possible. And I'd say 90% of that it goes with as far as rehearsal. Obviously, you got to know what you're doing and know how to play your instrument and be well rehearsed. But outside of that, the last 10% or so comes down to the audio engineer that you choose. And so stay away from people who don't know what they're doing. If you don't have a body of work to listen to from them, don't work with them. If anybody chooses to work with me, I have no problem. Here, this is music I've recorded, mixed, and mastered myself. If you don't like the genre of it, that's fine, but this is stuff that I personally do, and I have no problem showing people my own work. And I've had people say, yeah, I don't really like your music, but it sounds good. That's fine. That doesn't hurt my feelings one bit. I don't expect everyone to like all my musical endeavors. But if you don't ask an engineer, hey, can I hear some of your work? Don't be surprised when you get something back that doesn't sound good. And if they are offended that you're asking to hear some of their work, don't work with them. Because I don't think any mix engineer should have any problem with allowing you to hear some of their previous work or what they're capable of doing. And just like any reputable engineer is also going to probably want to hear, at least some rough demos of what you're doing for a number of reasons. One of them being there are some people who have asked me to mix stuff for them, and the bottom line is, sure, I could just take their money, but I don't want them to tell anybody that I mixed that album because the performances are just so bad, the music's bad, everything's poorly done. And there's nothing I can really do to make it sound good. All I can do is embellish it and make it sound better, but I'm never going to make it sound good. And so it's one of those things, I would rather be honest with them and tell them, hey, I don't necessarily mind mixing it, but I think for your sake, you'd be better off re-recording this or reconsidering the direction you're choosing on this. Because if it's not ready to be mixed, there's no point in really entertaining things unless it's just hey, if the money's there, it's there, and I get that. But generally speaking, if the raw tracks are pretty poorly recorded and the performances are bad, there is generally not a budget. So, like I said, if the engineer is not willing to give you anything that they've recorded, it's probably because they have very little to show in the way of work that they've done in the past. But I have no problem letting anybody hear my work because, in my mind, letting someone hear my work is going to lend credibility because I do not claim to be the best mix engineer, but you know what? I can get the job done. And if you don't like the way I do stuff, that's fine. Don't choose me. I'm not the right guy for you. Right? So that's just my mentality of being a quote unquote mix engineer, if I can dare call myself that. And so if somebody doesn't have that same mentality, you probably shouldn't work with them. So I just kind of talked about, don't pick people who don't have experience suitable to call themselves mix engineers. Don't work with them. Don't pay them money. Don't waste your time. So, well, how do you find someone? Well, there's a lot of things you can do. Ask around. Talk to people who do have good sounding albums. If there's a local band that you've heard, don't be afraid to send them an email. Give them a phone call and ask them, hey, I really like the way your music sounds, and where did you go to record it? You might be surprised to find that they actually the band has a member or knows somebody who has an in-home studio that's not widely advertised or well known about, and the guy or girl really knows what they're doing well enough to be able to make an album that you thought sounded good, and they'll likely record you, mix or master your work for a very reasonable price, which is basically how my sort of system runs, and most people kind of in my position, that's how we generally operate, is by word of mouth. I'd say word of mouth is how, even in the big studio world, that's how it works, because we all have our personal networks, and if you have, a couple of guys that you think do pretty good work and that, are on your frequent call list, those are the people you're generally going to work with. So just networking and finding people who are good at mixing, mastering, all that kind of stuff, finding those people is part of the process, and you shouldn't wait until after your tracks are recorded if you're doing it at home, or till right at the point that you're ready to start recording. I mean, obviously, you want to have songs written and be doing your pre-production, but once you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm pretty close to done with most of my pre-production, I need to start at least thinking about recording my songs, that's when you need to start looking around and networking, making phone calls, and saying, hey, when are you available? Because a lot of these guys who have these kind of like in-home studios and do mixing and mastering on the side and recording on the side, they oftentimes have full-time jobs. So it's one of those things, hey, I won't be able to do it, have time until such and such dates, so that's just the reality of working with people like that. Of course, you can always call any of these local studios, and they should be willing to let you hear what they're capable of doing. Take a little tour. They generally are happy to do that. And that's not necessarily a bad way to go either, because at the very least, that they're invested enough in what they do to have a commercial facility and overhead, right? But at the same time, be realistic that comes at a premium price, which gets me to the next point. Okay, so what's your budget? That is a huge thing that people don't really, I think, put as much effort into thinking about as they should. What are your expectations with that budget, right? And generally speaking, people want to get as much as they can for as little as they can. That makes sense, because it's kind of hard to want to spend $10,000 mixing and mastering your album, right? Especially if it's something you recorded yourself at home or recorded kind of on the cheap by using studio. It's just mainly for like maybe the drums and the vocals or something like that, but the rest you did at home. And I get that. I think we all understand that it's hard to want to spend lots of money on mixing and mastering. And a lot of times you'll find that there are people who are kind of hobbyists at mixing and mastering, or students at a school that are looking for experience and are willing to do things for free or for very, very little money. But at the end of the day, if you intend to do anything with your music, it needs to sound professional. And realize that if somebody has never made a professional sounding album, you do not want them touching yours. So let's think about our budget and what it will really get you. So a question I get a lot is, well, how much do you charge to do X or do Y? And I always tell them, well, it depends. If you want me to mix and master your album, if I had to guess, it'll probably range from somewhere to $100 to $500 a song. And the more songs you have, I might do it for less. It just depends. If you're somebody who I think is going to be a Grammy-winning artist based on the music you have, I'll probably do it for free and just negotiate a 1 point of record sales, But so far, that hasn't happened, and I doubt it ever will. So more than likely, you're not that person, right? So I always tell them, just be realistic. If it's one of those things where it's just going to be mostly a pleasure to work on, the songs are well recorded, it's not going to take much time to edit them. It's basically bring up the levels, flavor them the way I need to, get them to sit right in a mix. make sure that they all sound the same on the album and are at a decent, acceptable volume, and sound good on as many systems as possible, and it's an absolute joy to work on, I probably will charge you somewhere $100 to $200 a song. Now, if it takes me 2 to 3 hours just to edit your vocals, because they are on 20 different tracks, and I have to do serious comping work, and then have to pitch correct them, and then do boatloads of automation because the volumes are just all over the place, and there's plosives and pops and clip spots where it's clipping, and just the breaths and the way that you come in and exit notes sounds awful, and you want it to sound professional because at the end of the day, I want you to sound good, as professional as possible. I don't look good if you sound bad, right? Then it's going to cost probably at least $500 depending on how much work it is. And so, that's kind of how I go about this, And I tell them, be realistic. Hey, I have no problem doing whatever I can for you, but just be realistic on how much work it's going to take to make your music professional. Because if I don't feel I can make it sound professional, there's no point in you spending money on it, right? And I'll be flat out honest with them. I don't claim to be the best anywhere near it. I don't charge, exorbitant amounts of money to do this. It's a hobby for me. But if I hear the material, that the rough tracks or the rough mix, and it's plainly obvious that there's nothing I can do to make it sound professional, there's no point in going forward, in my opinion. However, there are times where, those circumstances can be different. For example, if it is a live tracked album, something along the lines of they played a show at a concert, or it was a sermon with music and it was like a whole entire presentation, or a theatrical play kind of a thing, then it's understandable that there is no re-tracking that. What you got is what you got. There's no recreating that. So those are situations that are, don't come up all the time, but I have had things where it's like a praise group put on a performance at a church, and it was really pretty awesome sounding, regardless of what your faith is. Just the overall song quality and everything was good. Unfortunately, the recording quality really was not. But so that would be an instance where, hey, I'm probably not going to get it to sound professional, but I can get it sounding considerably better. And that would be an example of where, hey, I'm willing to work on something that's maybe substandard and not incapable of quite getting to a pro sounding level. But then again, when people generally don't expect something that was tracked live, like a concert or at a church service, they don't expect it to sound like a studio album, right? So it's not as important, right? So long as the performances are decent and it's possible to get a good sound at the end, I'm willing to work on it. However, how much are they willing to spend? So that's something that I look as a mix engineer is this person realistic? And I've had, fortunately, that the people that I tend to work with are very realistic. Usually they understand what their music sounds like. And I try to make them feel very comfortable with me, and I try not to criticize their work or anything like that. I just try to mention things as politely as I can and really do what I can to be objective and use words like, I think the backup vocals are perhaps a little bit forward for my taste, or something like that. But when in reality, what I'm really referring to is the backup singers are out of tune and sound bad, right? Yet I'm not going to say that, you know what I mean? Because then it's going to offend them. So I think that if the engineer is willing to be honest with you as to what they charge, that's the kind of person you want to work with. And you need to understand the budget, have clear expectations of what your budget is and what you expect to get with it, and what the engineer is willing to do on that budget. If your budget is $100 to mix and master, I'm not going to necessarily say no, but don't expect to call me up, and asking for a ton of revisions. Not happening. If it's like something where it's $100 a song to mix and master, yeah, I might be willing to do that, as long as I don't have to edit things severely to make them sound good. Now, it's one thing for me to maybe kind of be like, okay, let me add a little a slope, automation slope to the beginning of this vocal line, just to kind of make it come in a little smoother, so it's not smashing the crap out of the compressor the second it comes in. That's to be expected. A little bit of that kind of stuff I don't mind doing. But if it's going to take me 2 hours to just pitch correct your vocals, not doing it for $100. For $100, I will pitch correct your vocals and edit them. All right. But I will not mix and master every song on your track for $100 each if it's going to take me 4 hours to get a decent vocal performance of compilation and auto tuning. Right. So pick a budget that you think is realistic to get a good product. Right. And if you don't think your budget's going to get you a good product, save up until you can get a budget that will get you a good product. Because unless it's just the coolest sounding music or something that the engineer thinks could help, make their portfolio look better, or you're the kind of person that they feel is going to get them more work just by word of mouth from you, they may be willing to work with you at a discounted price. However, outside of those reasons, you got to take into consideration that it costs them time at the very least. So take your budget and be realistic. So if you have a 15-song album, better yet, let's say a 10-song album just for the sake of easier math, it is not unrealistic for that to cost, $3,000 to mix and master. That is not unrealistic. $5,000 is not unrealistic. All right. However, if you have a 10-song album and you say, hey, I've got $1,000, can you mix and master this and make it sound good? For me, it's kind of hard to want to turn away from $1,000, right? But at the same time, I'm doing each track mix and mastering for $100 each. However, if you come to me with, yeah, I got these 2 tracks I want you to mix and master, and I listen to them, I'm like, oh, these are going to take a lot of work, and the overall budget's $200 to do it, not as interested, So that, just kind of keep that in mind, that your engineers got to eat too, and they have time, and it's worth different amounts of money to different people, right? But understand, good engineers know that they're good and know that they don't have to work for peanuts. So keep that in mind. Okay, and so finally, I think it is important when choosing a mix engineer to look for somebody that you can work with, right? They don't necessarily have to be the world's biggest hip-hop enthusiast or the world's biggest Christian music enthusiast to work on your music and do a good job of it. However, they do need to be respectful of what you're trying to do. If you're doing electric dance music and the person that you're talking to about doing your work really scoffs and looks down his nose at electric-based music, that's not your guy. Not to say he necessarily couldn't do a decent job of it, but that's not your guy. You want somebody who understands your genre as best as possible, and more importantly, is somebody that you feel will work with you. And I found that there are people who tend to have this idea in their heads that they are the all knowledgeable, knowing deities of audio, when in reality, very few of the people should ever have that rationale. And I think that most people who really are the gods of audio do not have that attitude about them. So I think ego is something that gets in the way with some engineers. I would say the best ones don't have that ego about them. They may have a confidence about them, and they may be willing to take risks, but at the same time, a good engineer realizes that they are there to serve you, not themselves. So look for somebody who you feel is genuinely going to serve you and your music as well as they possibly can, and is not just going to insert their their opinions and look down on yours. At the same time, realize that you as the recording artist are probably not an expert in audio engineering, and that there's a reason why you're contacting them or looking to them to record or mix or master your album. In this case, we're talking about mixing primarily, but realize that they probably know way more about this than you do. In fact, they've probably forgotten more about the subject of mixing than you have. So it is definitely, the artist should have the final call in all this because they're paying for it. But I think it's very important to realize as an artist that you need to let the engineer work. And the more you tie their hands, the less they can do for you. And I've found people who just are unwilling to accept reality when it comes to mixing. One of the big ones is, oh, I want the bass to be huge. I want the kick drum to be huge. I want the low tune drop A electric guitars to be huge. You know? Oh, and just for shits and giggles, I'm going to throw in some timpanis in there. And then they don't seem to realize that they all can't be the biggest part. You know, something has to be compromised. And I think that's something that oftentimes artists don't understand, is that there is such a thing as compromise. The bigger bass drum you want, the less bass guitar you're going to get. If you want the vocals to really stand out, you probably need to back off the guitars a little bit. Now, there's definitely creative ways to do this to make a happy medium and to make it, you know, not so obvious of what you're doing and make it blend and gel and fit good. But I think sometimes artists will interject their opinions because of something they've heard or just this general feeling they have, and they just know somehow that that's how it's supposed to be. And they really get in the way of the process of mixing and get it to where not only is the mixer frustrated because he can't help them, they're also frustrated because the artist is forcing them to do bad work. And so, once again, if that's how you want to do things and you want to be a complete control freak about stuff, I'm not saying that there aren't people willing to listen or to work with you, myself included. However, if what you're doing is going to make my work sound bad or their work sound bad, then they probably don't want to work with you. And if it'll be very apparent pretty quickly, just kind of talking, you know, briefly on, you know, kind of with each other about budget, you know, listening to your rough demos or your raw tracks and just kind of talking shop about what your budget, timing, and your expectations are. Because I think if the both of y'all have the recording and engineer, or I'm sorry, if the artist and the engineer are on the same page or very close to it, and they feel that, hey, I'm excited about this, that's who you want to work with. You want to work with someone who is excited to work with you, and you want to be excited to work with them. That's a healthy relationship, not just in any business, but especially in this, because when you're working with somebody on their music, there is a certain emotional connection I feel that is healthy to have with each other. Now, it may end the second, you know, y'all separate paths, but every time your paths meet, it's really encouraging when there is just a good connection. And music is one of those things that connects people. So the engineer wants to be excited on what they're working on. And so, you know, let the engineer get excited about what they're doing. Let them mix the work. Give your direction, tell them what you want to do, maybe have some reference tracks or albums of, hey, this is kind of the direction I'm going for, right? And the engineer can listen to that and like, okay, cool, I think I got what you're looking for. Let them do a mix, right? And then let them send it to you. Listen to it, process it, maybe come back to it a little bit later, listen to it again, and then give your honest feedback, all right? And go from there. Now, once again, when it comes to revisions and how many revisions are reasonable for a budget, if your budget is $100, you know, to mix a song, well, I might be able to do hey, this is what I did based on what you told me, and from there, yeah, I'll do a revision or hey, some minor tweaks, because I expect that what I think and what the artist is envisioning may differ a little bit. But if the artist tells the engineer, hey, this is what I'm looking for, and the engineer then comes pretty close to matching that, and the artist then doesn't want it and decides that they want to take it a completely different direction, I don't think that that's very fair to the engineer, because they basically did what they said they were going to do. They did what you asked them to do, and they're doing it for the amount of money that y'all agreed to. And then the artist is coming back and doing a complete 180 on the direction. That's fine. The budget is now $200 to mix this song, because you just completely did a 180. So all that work that they did, they have to completely restart and go back over and start from ground one or from ground zero. However, if it's something like good criticism to give the engineer is, hey, I like it. I feel like the vocals are a little bit too far back in the mix. I think on my playback system, it seems like the hi-hats were a little bit loud. This, that, the other thing, that's fine, But at the same time, realize that as the artist, you're probably not listening to as good of a playback system as they are. So I think a good thing to do is be realistic and trust your engineer's ears to know what sounds best. Now, if there's some very gleaming things, like if on your speakers, perhaps the hi-hats are a little bit, how do I say it? Tingy, or the high end is a little bit overly bright for your taste, don't worry about that so much, because that's the kind of thing that could very easily be a problem with your speaker or your listening environment, right? That's not a big deal. But if it's something more like, that effect you put on the drum set, I'm just not digging it at that part, or hey, can we add the room sound, the reverb? I don't really care for how that sounds. That's completely different. I'm talking about major things. Hey, I don't really care for the delay effect that you put on the vocals. That's good stuff. But it's minor things like, hey, I feel like the vocals could be half a decibel louder in these 2 bars of the verse. At $100, you're not paying for it. Don't ask for it. All right, guys, thanks for listening, and I'll catch y'all next time. Adios.